In the small industrial town of Norwood Park Township, just outside Chicago, there lived a man who seemed to have it all figured out. He owned a successful construction company, threw the best parties on the block, and had a photograph with the First Lady hanging proudly on his wall. By day, he was the kind of neighbor you'd want living next door. By night, he was something else entirely, something that would make your blood run cold. His name was John Wayne Gacy, and for 6 terrifying years, he operated as one of America's most prolific serial killers, murdering at least 33 young men and boys. But here's what made Gacy different from every other monster you've heard about. He didn't lurk in shadows or abandoned buildings. He didn't wear masks or hide in the darkness. Instead, he hid in plain sight behind a smile, a handshake, and a clown costume. This is the story of how a man could fool an entire community while committing acts so horrific that even seasoned detectives struggled to process what they were seeing. This is the story of how 33 families lost their sons, their brothers, their futures, while their killer was being praised as a pillar of the community. And this is the story of how evil can wear the most ordinary face of all. John Wayne Gacy was born on March the 17th, 1942, at Edgewater Hospital in Chicago. He came into this world as the second of 3 children, the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robison. His father was an auto repair machinist and a World War I veteran. His mother was a homemaker who tried her best to shield her children from the storm that was brewing inside their own home. From the very beginning, something was wrong in the Gacy household. John Stanley Gacy was an alcoholic, a man whose demons from the war had never been properly addressed. Every evening, he would disappear into the family basement with a bottle where neighbors could hear him talking to himself, holding conversations with friends who had died in the trenches of France. The basement became his sanctuary, his prison, and eventually it would become the place where his son learned some of his darkest lessons. The relationship between father and son was toxic from the start. John Stanley constantly belittled his boy, calling him dumb and stupid, and comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest memories was being beaten at age 4 for accidentally disarranging car engine components. His father's response wasn't to teach or correct, but to punish with brutal efficiency. When Marion tried to protect her son from his father's abuse, it only made things worse. John Stanley would accuse the boy of being a sissy and a mama's boy, predicting that he would probably grow up queer. These weren't just words thrown in anger. They were systematic attempts to break down whatever confidence and self-worth the child might have been building. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Despite the abuse, despite the constant humiliation, young John Wayne Gacy was actually intelligent. He had an IQ of 118, signifying near superior intelligence. He wasn't the failure his father claimed he was. He was a bright child trapped in a nightmare that was shaping him into something monstrous. At age 11, something happened that would change everything. Gacy was hit in the back of the head so hard that it caused a blood clot in his brain. For 5 years, from age 11 to 16, he suffered from unexplained blackouts. Doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. The clot wasn't discovered until he was 16, and when it was finally treated with medication, the blackouts stopped. But the damage was done. Those 5 years of mysterious episodes, combined with his father's abuse, had created cracks in his psyche that would eventually split wide open. School became another battleground. Gacy attended Cooley Vocational High School, then transferred to Prosser Vocational High School after 1 year. But the academic environment couldn't hold his attention. He was dealing with too much at home, too much in his own head. He dropped out midway through his sophomore year, another failure in his father's eyes, another reason for disappointment and abuse. At 18, Gacy made a decision that would foreshadow his future in ways no one could have imagined. He ran away to Las Vegas, where he found work at a mortuary. For several months, he worked around dead bodies, and according to his later confessions, he engaged in acts of necrophilia twice during this period. He described the corpses as just dead things who couldn't tell anybody. Even at 18, he was already developing a relationship with death that was deeply disturbing. But this wasn't the story of a young man spiraling into madness. This was the story of a young man learning to wear masks. When Gacy returned to Chicago, he didn't continue down a path of obvious destruction. Instead, he enrolled in business college and graduated. He discovered that he had a natural talent for salesmanship. He was charming, persuasive, and could talk his way into or out of almost any situation. In 1964, at age 22, Gacy married and moved to Iowa with his wife, where he managed his father-in-law's Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. To the outside world, he looked like a success story, a young man who had overcome a difficult childhood and was building a respectable life. He and his wife had 2 children, and for a brief moment it seemed like John Wayne Gacy might have found his way to normalcy. But the mask was already slipping. In 1968, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting one of his male employees, a teenage boy. The charges weren't just allegations. They were serious enough that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His wife, horrified by what she had discovered about the man she married, divorced him immediately. The respectable life he had built crumbled in a matter of months. Gacy served his time at the Iowa State Men's Reformatory, where he underwent psychological evaluation. But here's what's truly chilling about this part of the story. He was a model prisoner. He didn't cause trouble, didn't fight with other inmates, didn't give the guards any reason to extend his sentence. He was released on parole in 1970 after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence. The system had looked at John Wayne Gacy, seen a man who had made a mistake, and decided he deserved a second chance. They had no idea they were releasing a predator who had spent those 18 months not reflecting on his crimes, but planning his next move. When Gacy was released, he didn't slink away to another state or try to disappear. Instead, he moved back to the Chicago area where he had grown up. After a few months of living with his mother, he purchased a house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township. It was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and watched out for each other's children. Gacy immediately set about reinventing himself. He started a construction company called PDM Contractors, and he was good at it. He hired the teenage boys and young men to help with the work, and his business grew steadily. He became popular with his neighbors, throwing theme parties and establishing himself as the kind of person who made the neighborhood a better place to live. But the most disturbing part of his reinvention was his involvement with local politics and charity work. Gacy joined the Democratic Party and worked his way up to become a precinct captain. He had his employees clean party headquarters at no charge, and he was rewarded with positions of increasing responsibility. He served on the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee and eventually became leader of Chicago's Polish Constitution Day parade. It was in this role that he had his photograph taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter. Think about that for a moment. A man who had already committed sexual assault, a man who was already planning his next series of crimes, was standing next to the First Lady of the United States, smiling for the cameras, being celebrated as a community leader. Around the same time, Gacy discovered another way to build his public image. Through his membership in a local moose club, he learned about a Jolly Joker clown club whose members performed at fundraising events and entertained hospitalized children. In late 1975, Gacy joined the club and created his own characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. He designed his own makeup and costumes, describing Pogo as a happy clown and Patches as a more serious character. He seldom earned money for his performances, claiming that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into childhood. He performed at parties, political functions, charitable events, and children's hospitals throughout the Chicago area. The community loved him. Here was a successful businessman who donated his time to make children smile, who worked tirelessly for local political causes, who threw parties that brought neighbors together. He was exactly the kind of person every community wants to have. He was also exactly the kind of person who could get away with murder. The facade was perfect. By the mid-1970s, John Wayne Gacy had constructed what appeared to be an ideal life. His construction company, PDM Contractors, was thriving. He threw elaborate parties at his Norwood Park Township home, complete with themed decorations and costumes. Neighbors knew him as the generous guy who'd help with odd jobs, the one who'd dress up as Pogo the Clown for charity events and children's birthday parties. His involvement in Democratic politics had even earned him a photograph with First Lady Rosalind Carter. But beneath this carefully crafted image, something far more sinister was taking shape. Gacy's construction business wasn't just a source of income and respectability, it was a hunting ground. Most of PDM's workforce consisted of high school students and young men, many of them runaways or kids from broken homes who desperately needed work. These weren't the children of prominent families or well-connected individuals. They were society's invisible, the ones who could disappear without causing much of a stir. And Gacy knew this. He had a system. He would proposition his workers for sexual favors, often framing it as a requirement for keeping their jobs or getting promotions. He'd lend them money, let them use his vehicles, then demand repayment in ways that had nothing to do with cash. The power dynamic was clear. He was the boss, the adult, the one with money and connections. They were just kids trying to survive. When employees resisted his advances or threatened to quit, Gacy would make his position crystal clear. He once told a worker, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you, and how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" It wasn't an idle threat. It was a promise. The killing began in earnest on January 3rd, 1972. His first victim was Timothy Jack McCoy, a 16-year-old boy Gacy had picked up at the Greyhound bus station. McCoy was just another runaway, another forgotten kid trying to make his way in the world. Gacy lured him back to his house on Summerdale Avenue and there, in his bedroom, he stabbed the boy to death. But killing McCoy wasn't enough. Something inside Gacy had been awakened, a hunger that wouldn't be satisfied with just one death. He discovered that he enjoyed the act itself, the complete control over another human being. The power was intoxicating. Gacy developed a routine, a methodology that would serve him for the next 6 years. He would target young men, often those who worked for him or others he encountered through his business. He'd invite them to his house under various pretenses: a job interview, a party, a chance to make some quick money. Once they were inside, he would incapacitate them. His preferred method was what he called his rope trick and handcuff trick. He would tell his victims he wanted to show them a magic trick, something he'd learned during his clown performances. He'd demonstrate how he could escape from handcuffs or a rope around his neck, making it look easy and fun. Then he'd convince them to try it themselves, promising to teach them the secret. But there was no secret. There was no escape. Once the handcuffs clicked shut or the rope tightened around their necks, his victims were completely at his mercy, and John Wayne Gacy had no mercy to give. What followed was a nightmare of torture and sexual assault. Gacy would keep his victims alive for hours, sometimes days, subjecting them to unspeakable horrors. He would rape them repeatedly, torture them with various implements, and when he finally grew bored, he would kill them either by strangulation or asphyxiation. The disposal of bodies became as methodical as the murders themselves. Gacy's house sat on a large lot with a crawl space beneath the main floor. It was the perfect burial ground. He would drag the bodies down there, dig shallow graves in the dirt, and cover them with lime to speed decomposition and mask the smell. As the years passed and the body count grew, space became an issue. 26 bodies were eventually crammed into that crawl space, buried so close together that in some cases they were stacked on top of each other. When there was no more room beneath the house, Gacy expanded his cemetery to other parts of his property. 3 more bodies were buried in his backyard, but even his property had limits. When he ran out of space entirely, Gacy began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. He would weigh them down with concrete or chains, drive to a secluded spot along the riverbank, and roll them into the water. 4 victims met this fate, their bodies carried away by the current. The stench of death became a constant presence in Gacy's home. His second wife, Carol Hoff, whom he'd married in 1972, began complaining about a terrible smell that seemed to come from beneath the house. Gacy would dismiss her concerns, claiming it was a sewer problem or dead animals that had crawled under the house and died. But Carol wasn't stupid. She found wallets belonging to young men in Gacy's car. She noticed that teenage boys would come to the house looking for work and never be seen again. The smell grew stronger, more putrid. It was the smell of rotting human flesh, and somewhere deep down, she knew it. Their marriage couldn't survive the secrets Gacy was keeping. In 1976, Carol filed for divorce. She moved out of the house, taking her daughters with her, leaving Gacy alone with his growing collection of corpses. The isolation suited him perfectly. With no wife to ask uncomfortable questions, no children to worry about, Gacy could operate with complete freedom. The parties continued, the clown performances went on, and all the while, young men kept disappearing. The community around him remained oblivious. How could they suspect the man who entertained their children, who helped organize parades and political events, who seemed so normal, so helpful, so integrated into their world. The cognitive dissonance was too great. People see what they want to see, and what they wanted to see was a successful businessman and community leader, not a monster. But monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like your neighbor. Sometimes they throw the best parties on the block. Sometimes they dress up as clowns and make children laugh. And sometimes they bury 33 bodies beneath their house while maintaining the perfect facade of respectability. The killing continued through the mid-1970s, an assembly line of death that Gacy had perfected to a chilling degree. Each murder was calculated, efficient, and completely hidden from the world above. The man who had once been photographed with the First Lady was simultaneously running one of the most prolific serial killing operations in American history, and he was getting away with it. The year was 1970, and John Wayne Gacy was walking out of the Iowa State Men's Reformatory, a free man. 18 months behind bars for sexually assaulting a teenage boy, but to everyone around him, he looked like someone ready to start fresh, clean-shaven, well-dressed, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that made people trust him almost immediately. What they didn't know was that prison hadn't reformed John Wayne Gacy. It had only taught him how to hide better. Moving back to the Chicago area, Gacy didn't slink into the shadows like most ex-convicts. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He inserted himself directly into the heart of respectable society. After a few months living with his mother, he purchased a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park Township. It was a quiet residential neighborhood, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and children rode bikes on tree-lined streets. The perfect camouflage for a predator. Gacy understood something most criminals don't. The best place to hide isn't in darkness, it's in plain sight. He threw elaborate theme parties that became the talk of the neighborhood, barbecues in his backyard where he'd flip burgers and crack jokes with local families, Christmas parties where he'd dress up as Santa Claus, handing out gifts to children who squealed with delight. He was charming, generous, the kind of neighbor everyone wanted to have. But beneath that carefully constructed facade, something sinister was taking shape. He started a construction company called P-Del-M Contractors, naming it after his initials and the word contractors. The business became his hunting ground, though no one realized it at the time. He specifically targeted high school students and young men for his workforce, vulnerable kids who needed money, who were looking for someone to believe in them. Gacy had a talent for spotting the ones who were struggling at home, the ones who felt invisible, the ones who wouldn't be missed right away if they disappeared. His employees later described a boss who could be incredibly generous one moment and terrifyingly controlling the next. He'd lend them his car, give them advances on their pay, take them out for drinks. But there was always a price: sexual favors in exchange for promotions, unwanted advances that left young men confused and uncomfortable, and for those who resisted, there were threats. Gacy would casually mention his gun collection, how easy it would be to make someone disappear. Most of his workers were too young and too scared to report him. In 1972, Gacy married Carol Hoff, a divorced mother of 2 daughters. She moved into the house on Summerdale Avenue, and for a brief moment it seemed like Gacy might actually be settling into a normal life. But Carol began noticing things, strange smells coming from the crawl space beneath the house, wallets belonging to young men that she'd find in his car. When she asked about them, Gacy would brush off her concerns with explanations that sounded reasonable but never quite sat right. The smell was the worst part. It would seep up through the floorboards, particularly during the hot summer months. A thick, nauseating odor that made her feel sick to her stomach. When she confronted Gacy about it, he told her it was probably a sewage problem, or maybe some animal had died under the house. He'd have it looked at, he promised, but the smell never went away. It only got worse. What Carol didn't know was that beneath her feet, in the cramped crawl space under their family home, John Wayne Gacy was building a graveyard. His first victim had been killed on January 3rd, 1972, just 2 months after he'd moved into the house. Timothy Jack McCoy, a 16-year-old boy Gacy had picked up at the Greyhound bus station. Gacy later claimed it was self-defense, that the boy had threatened him with a knife, but the evidence told a different story. The massive bloodstain investigators would eventually find on the underside of the bedroom carpet suggested something far more violent and premeditated. After killing McCoy, Gacy faced a problem that would become all too familiar. What to do with the body? He couldn't risk driving around with a corpse, couldn't take it to a remote location without the possibility of being seen, so he did something that revealed the true depths of his depravity. He dug a shallow grave in the crawl space beneath his own house. It was cramped, filthy work, but it solved his immediate problem, and it gave him an idea. The crawl space became Gacy's private cemetery. After each murder, he'd drag the body down there, sometimes while his wife and stepdaughters slept upstairs. He'd dig another shallow grave, cover it with lime to mask the smell, and go back to his normal life. Breakfast with the family, a day at the construction site, dinner and television in the evening, as if nothing had happened. But Gacy's appetite for killing was growing. What started as one murder became 2, then 3, then more. He developed a system, a ritual that he would repeat with horrifying efficiency. He'd lure his victims to the house with promises of work or drugs or just a place to hang out. Once inside, he'd offer them a drink, often laced with chloroform. When they became groggy, he'd suggest showing them a magic trick. The handcuff trick was Gacy's specialty. He'd put on the cuffs himself, then quickly escape, making it look easy. When his victims asked how he did it, he'd offer to teach them, but once the handcuffs were on, there was no escape. What followed was hours of torture, sexual assault, and ultimately murder. Sometimes by strangulation, sometimes by asphyxiation, sometimes by methods too brutal to describe in detail. By 1976, the marriage to Carol was falling apart. She couldn't stand the smell anymore, couldn't ignore the wallets and jewelry that kept appearing in his car. She filed for divorce, taking her daughters and moving out of the house. Gacy was alone again, which meant he was free to escalate his crimes without the inconvenience of a family asking questions. Living alone, Gacy's killing spree intensified. He no longer had to worry about explaining strange noises in the night or the increasingly putrid smell emanating from beneath the house. He could bring victims home whenever he wanted, could take his time with the torture and murder, could dispose of the bodies at his leisure. The crawl space was filling up, grave by grave, victim by victim. During this same period, Gacy was building his reputation in the community. He joined the local Democratic Party, Working his way up to precinct captain, he organized volunteers, hosted fundraisers, and rubbed shoulders with local politicians. In 1978, he was even photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Polish Constitution Day parade event. The image would later become one of the most chilling photographs in criminal history. A serial killer grinning beside the president's wife, hiding in plain sight. But perhaps Gacy's most disturbing public persona was his work as a clown. In 1975, he joined a local clown club and created two characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. Pogo was supposed to be the happy one, with a colorful costume and exaggerated makeup. Patches was more serious, more subdued. Gacy would perform at children's birthday parties, hospital visits, and charity events throughout the Chicago area. He rarely charged for his services, which only added to his reputation as a generous community member. The irony was lost on no one who knew the full story. Here was a man who was torturing and murdering young men in his basement, then putting on makeup and entertaining children on the weekends. He'd come home from a birthday party where he'd made balloon animals and performed magic tricks, then go down to his crawl space to check on his decomposing victims. The duality was so extreme, it seemed almost impossible to believe. But that's exactly what made Gacy so dangerous. He understood that people see what they want to see. A successful businessman, a community volunteer, a man who made children laugh. Who would suspect that behind the grease paint and the jovial exterior was someone capable of such monstrous acts? It was the perfect disguise, and Gacy wore it with the skill of a master manipulator. As the 1970s progressed, young men in the Chicago area began disappearing at an alarming rate. Runaways mostly, or kids from troubled homes. The kind of victims that society tends to overlook. Police reports were filed, but the cases quickly went cold. These weren't the children of prominent families or honor students with bright futures. They were throwaways, and in the homophobic climate of the era, many of their disappearances were simply attributed to the lifestyle choices of troubled youth. Gacy preyed on this societal indifference. He knew that a missing gay teenager or a runaway from a broken home wouldn't generate the same level of police attention as a missing suburban kid. He was counting on it. And for years, his calculation proved correct. The bodies kept piling up in his crawl space, and no one connected the dots. By 1978, Gacy had killed at least 33 young men and boys. 26 of them were buried beneath his house, their bodies stacked like cordwood in the cramped space. 3 more were buried elsewhere on his property. When he ran out of room in the crawl space, he began dumping bodies in the nearby Des Plaines River. The house on Summerdale Avenue had become a charnel house, a suburban home of horrors where death lived alongside the everyday routines of a seemingly normal life. But Gacy's reign of terror was about to come to an end. On December 11th, 1978, a 15-year-old honor student named Robert Piest would disappear after mentioning to his mother that he was going to talk to a contractor about a job. Unlike Gacy's previous victims, Robert wasn't a runaway or a troubled kid from the wrong side of town. He was a beloved son from a stable family, and when he vanished, his parents weren't going to let the police dismiss it as just another runaway case. The net was closing in on John Wayne Gacy, though he didn't know it yet. For 6 years, he'd managed to live a double life so completely that even those closest to him had no idea of the horrors happening beneath their feet. But every serial killer makes mistakes eventually, and Gacy's mistake was about to cost him everything. The investigation into Robert Piest's disappearance moved with an urgency that none of the previous cases had seen. This wasn't another runaway from the streets. This was an honor student, a beloved son who had simply vanished after mentioning a contractor's name. The difference in police response was immediate and telling. Within hours of the Piest family's report, Des Plaines police had identified John Wayne Gacy as the contractor Robert had gone to meet. A background check revealed what should have been a red flag years earlier. Gacy was a convicted sex offender, having served time in Iowa for the sexual assault of a teenage boy. He was supposed to be the kind of man parents warned their children about, yet here he was, operating freely in their community, running a business, entertaining at children's parties. The investigation began in earnest on December 12, 1978. Police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's property at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. What they expected to find was evidence of Robert Piest. What they discovered was far beyond anything they could have imagined. The search of Gacy's home began systematically. Officers combed through the house, looking for any trace of the missing teenager. It didn't take long for them to notice something disturbing. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, emanating from beneath the house. It was the smell of death, of decomposition, of something that had been hidden away for far too long. Detective Joseph Kozenjak, who had been leading the investigation, made the decision to examine the crawl space beneath Gacy's ranch-style home. What they found there would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. The cramped, dark space beneath the house had been turned into a makeshift cemetery. Bodies were buried in shallow graves, some wrapped in plastic, others simply covered with lime to mask the odor. The first body they uncovered was that of John Butkovich, the young man who had gone to collect his final paycheck from Gacy 3 years earlier. His family had reported him missing, but like so many others, he had been dismissed as just another runaway. Now his remains told a different story entirely. As the excavation continued, the true scope of Gacy's crimes became clear. Body after body was unearthed from the crawl space. Young men, teenagers, some barely more than children. They had been strangled, some showing signs of torture, others bearing the marks of Gacy's signature rope trick. The scene was methodical, organized, the work of someone who had been killing for years and had perfected his disposal methods. The media descended on Norwood Park like vultures. News vans lined the quiet suburban street as cameras captured the grim procession of body bags being carried from what had appeared to be just another ordinary American home. Neighbors watched in horror as the truth about their friendly, community-minded neighbor was revealed. The man who had entertained their children, who had worked on their political campaigns, who had seemed like such a pillar of the community, was one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The excavation took days. 26 bodies were recovered from the crawl space alone. 3 more were found buried elsewhere on Gacy's property. The house itself became a crime scene of unimaginable proportions. Every inch had to be examined, every piece of evidence cataloged. The smell of death permeated everything, seeping into the walls, the floors, the very foundation of what had been Gacy's killing ground. As investigators worked to identify the victims, A pattern emerged that highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed Gacy to operate for so long. Many of the young men had been reported missing by their families, but their disappearances had been dismissed by authorities. They were labeled as runaways, troublemakers, kids who had chosen to leave home. The reality was far more sinister. These weren't runaways, these were victims of a predator who had specifically targeted the vulnerable. Gacy had used his construction business as a hunting ground, luring young men with the promise of work, of steady pay, of a chance to make something of themselves. Instead, he had led them to their deaths. The identification process was painstaking and heartbreaking. Dental records, missing person reports, and desperate families hoping against hope that their loved one might still be alive. Some victims were identified quickly, their disappearances well documented. Others remained nameless, their identities lost to time and circumstance. Among the identified victims were employees of Gacy's construction company, young men who had simply been trying to earn a living. There was Gregory Godzik, 19 years old, who had worked for PDM contractors and vanished in 1976. His family had filed a missing person report, but like so many others, he had been written off as someone who had simply chosen to disappear. There was Rick Johnston, 17, who had gone missing in 1976 after telling friends he was going to a construction job. His mother had spent years searching for him, never giving up hope that he might still be alive. Now she had her answer, but it wasn't the one she had prayed for. The victims represented a cross-section of young American life in the 1970s. Some were from stable families, others from broken homes. Some were gay, others straight. Some were struggling with their identity. Others seemed to have their lives on track. What they all had in common was that they had crossed paths with John Wayne Gacy, and that encounter had cost them everything. As the investigation expanded, detectives began to piece together Gacy's methods. He had been incredibly methodical, almost businesslike in his approach to murder. He would lure victims to his home, often under the pretense of work or a party. Once there, he would incapacitate them, usually with his handcuff trick or rope trick. What followed was torture, a sexual assault, and ultimately death. The disposal of the bodies showed the same cold calculation. Gacy had chosen his burial sites carefully, maximizing the space in his crawl space like some macabre puzzle. When that space became full, he had turned to the Des Plaines River, dumping bodies in the water where they would be carried away by the current. The discovery of Robert Peace's body in the Des Plaines River confirmed what investigators already knew. He had been Gacy's final victim, the one whose disappearance had finally brought the killer's reign of terror to an end. The irony was bitter. It had taken the murder of a middle-class honor student to expose the deaths of dozens of young men whose lives had been deemed less valuable by society. The psychological profile of Gacy that emerged during the investigation was that of a man who had lived multiple lives simultaneously. To his neighbors, he was a successful businessman and community leader. To his employees, he was a demanding but fair boss. To the families whose children he entertained, he was a friendly clown who brought joy to their gatherings. But beneath all of these personas was a predator who had been hunting and killing for years. The investigation revealed that Gacy had been escalating his crimes over time. His first murder in 1972 had been somewhat impulsive, but by the mid-1970s, He had developed a system that allowed him to kill regularly while maintaining his public facade. He had become more confident, more brazen, more willing to take risks. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy sent shockwaves through Chicago and beyond. Here was a man who had seemed to embody the American dream, who had pulled himself up from a troubled past to become a successful businessman and community leader. The revelation that he was actually a monster who had been hiding in plain sight challenged everything people thought they knew about evil. The case also highlighted the vulnerabilities in American society that had allowed Gacy to operate for so long. The stigma surrounding homosexuality in the 1970s meant that many of his victims had been marginalized, their disappearances not taken seriously by authorities. The assumption that missing young men were simply runaways allowed Gacy to continue killing without serious scrutiny. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged about Gacy's methods and mindset. He had kept trophies from some of his victims, personal items that served as reminders of his crimes. He had also shown a disturbing level of comfort with death, often continuing to live normally in his house, even as bodies decomposed beneath his feet. The Gacy case would become a watershed moment in American criminal justice, highlighting the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies and more serious attention to missing person cases. It would also serve as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, that the monsters we fear most are often the ones living right next door. By the fall of 1978, John Wayne Gacy had been operating as a serial killer for nearly 6 years, maintaining his carefully constructed public persona while secretly disposing of bodies beneath his home on West Somerdale Avenue. The smell of death had become so overwhelming that his second wife, Carol, had complained about the stench emanating from beneath the house. She had even discovered wallets belonging to young men in his car, but like everyone else in Gacy's orbit, she had no idea of the true horror unfolding beneath her feet. The bodies were piling up in the cramped crawl space under his ranch-style home. 26 victims would eventually be found buried there, their remains packed so tightly that Gacy had run out of room. When the space became too crowded, he began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River, treating human lives like garbage to be discarded. The methodical nature of his disposal system revealed the calculated mind of a predator who had perfected his deadly routine. Gacy's victims shared tragic commonalities that made them perfect targets for a killer who understood how to exploit society's blind spots. Most were young men, aged 14 to 30, many of them runaways or gay teenagers who had been cast out by their families. In the 1970s, the stigma surrounding homosexuality was so severe that these vulnerable young men existed on the fringes of society, their disappearances often dismissed by authorities as typical runaway cases. The cultural homophobia of the era created an environment where crimes against gay men were not taken seriously, allowing Gacy to operate with shocking impunity. This systematic neglect of missing persons cases involving gay youth provided Gacy with the perfect hunting ground. When families reported their sons missing, police would often assume they had simply run away, especially if there was any suggestion of homosexuality. The prevailing attitude was that these young men had chosen their lifestyle and the dangers that came with it. This societal indifference meant that connections between disappearances were rarely made, and patterns that might have exposed Gacy's crimes went unnoticed for years. The case of John Butkovich exemplifies how Gacy's victims were systematically overlooked. Butkovich was 18 years old when he vanished on July 31st, 1975, after going to collect his final paycheck from PDM contractors. He had quit working for Gacy after 8 months, likely due to the contractor's inappropriate advances and increasingly disturbing behavior. When Butkovich failed to return home, his family reported him missing, but police showed little interest in investigating the disappearance of what they assumed was just another troubled young man. What made Butkovich's case particularly tragic was that his body was buried in Gacy's garage, closer to the house than the other victims. Gacy had killed him in a fit of rage, probably because Butkovich had threatened to expose his employer's criminal behavior. The teenager's remains would be the first recovered when police finally searched Gacy's property in December 1978. But by then, 3 years had passed, and dozens more young men had died. John Sick's disappearance in January 1977 demonstrated Gacy's cunning manipulation of the system. When the 19-year-old vanished, his family immediately contacted police, but their concerns were dismissed when investigators learned that Sick had supposedly sold his car to a respectable local businessman named John Wayne Gacy. The killer had brazenly used his public reputation to deflect suspicion, telling police that Sick needed money to leave town. The authorities accepted this explanation without question, never bothering to investigate further or verify Gacy's story. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times throughout the 1970s. Young men would disappear, families would report them missing, and police would file the cases away as runaways. Meanwhile, Gacy continued his double life, hosting neighborhood parties, performing as Pogo the Clown, and building his reputation as a pillar of the community. The contrast between his public persona and private crimes was so stark that even those closest to him struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he had become. The killing had become routine for Gacy, a practiced ritual that he had refined over years of murder. He would typically lure victims to his home with promises of work, drugs, or parties. Once inside, he would incapacitate them using his infamous handcuff trick, telling them he wanted to demonstrate a magic trick he had learned during his clown performances. The victims would allow themselves to be shackled, trusting the friendly contractor who seemed so eager to entertain them. But once the handcuffs clicked shut, there was no escape. What followed was hours of torture, sexual assault, and ultimately murder. Gacy would strangle his victims with rope or a makeshift garrote, sometimes prolonging their suffering for his own twisted pleasure. The basement of his home became a chamber of horrors where young men died in agony while their killer satisfied his darkest urges. After death, Gacy would drag the bodies to the crawl space, where he would bury them in shallow graves, often covering them with lime to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. The sheer volume of bodies beneath Gacy's house created logistical problems that would eventually contribute to his downfall. The crawl space measured only 3 feet in height, making it a cramped and nightmarish burial ground. As more victims accumulated, Gacy was forced to bury bodies closer together, sometimes stacking them on top of each other. The decomposition process filled the house with an overwhelming stench that became impossible to ignore, leading to complaints from family members and neighbors. By 1978, Gacy had killed at least 33 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His victims ranged from teenagers to young adults, all of them with their whole lives ahead of them. They were sons, brothers, friends, and lovers whose disappearances left families devastated and communities traumatized. Yet their deaths might have continued indefinitely if not for the disappearance of one final victim whose case would be impossible to ignore. By December 1978, the walls were closing in on John Wayne Gacy, though he didn't know it yet. For 6 years, he had operated with impunity, exploiting society's blind spots and the systemic neglect of vulnerable young men. But that was about to change forever. The evening of December 11th, 1978, started like any other for 15-year-old Robert Piest. He was working his part-time jobs at Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, alongside his friend and classmate Kim Byers. It was a bitter, cold night, 31 degrees, and Robert was bundled up in his favorite blue parka. His mother, Elizabeth, was celebrating her 46th birthday, and the whole family was waiting at home with cake and candles. Around 9 o'clock that evening, John Wayne Gacy walked into the pharmacy. He was there to discuss a remodeling job with the store owner, presenting himself as the successful contractor he appeared to be. Clean-cut, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence of a respected businessman. To everyone in that store, he was just another customer, another face in the crowd. But Robert Piest saw something else, an opportunity. When his mother, Elizabeth, arrived to pick him up at 8:55, Robert told her about the contractor in the parking lot. He wanted to talk to him about a potential job, maybe some part-time work to earn extra money. It seemed innocent enough, the kind of ambition you'd expect from a responsible teenager. Elizabeth waited as her son grabbed his coat and headed out into the cold December night. She watched him walk toward the parking lot, toward a man who had been killing young men for years. Robert Piest disappeared into the darkness, and he never came back. Hours passed. The birthday cake sat untouched on the kitchen table. The family searched frantically, driving through the neighborhood, calling friends, checking anywhere Robert might have gone, but he was nowhere to be found. By 11 o'clock that night, Harold and Elizabeth Piest were at the Des Plaines police station, their worst fears beginning to take shape. This time was different. Robert Piest wasn't a runaway. He wasn't a troubled kid from a broken home. He was an honor student from a loving family, the kind of teenager who called when he was going to be late, who had never given his parents a moment's worry. When Robert disappeared, people noticed. When Robert disappeared, people cared. The police took the case seriously from the beginning. They learned that Robert had last been seen talking to a contractor named John Wayne Gacy, and within hours they had traced that name to the house on Summerdale Avenue. But when they ran a background check on Gacy, they discovered something that sent chills down their spines. He had a criminal record. In 1968, he had been convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa and sentenced to 10 years in prison, though he had served only 18 months. The pieces were falling into place, but Gacy still wore his mask of respectability. When investigators first approached him, he was calm, cooperative, even helpful. He admitted to meeting Robert at the pharmacy, but claimed the boy had never gotten into his car. He suggested that Robert might have run away, might have gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd. He played the part of the concerned community member, the successful businessman who just wanted to help find a missing teenager. But the police weren't buying it. They obtained a search warrant for Gacy's property, and on December 13th, 1978, they began what would become one of the most horrific crime scene investigations in American history. They were looking for clues about Robert Paist's disappearance. What they found instead was evidence of a killing spree that had gone undetected for years. The search began in the house itself. Officers noticed an unusual smell, a sickly sweet odor that seemed to permeate the entire structure. Gacy explained it away as moisture problems, sewer issues, the kinds of mundane explanations that had satisfied neighbors and visitors for years. But the investigators weren't satisfied. They kept digging, kept looking, kept following their noses toward the source of that terrible smell. It was in the crawl space beneath the house that they made their first discovery. In the confined, dark space under Gacy's ranch-style home, they found human remains. Not just one body, but multiple bodies, buried in shallow graves in the lime-covered dirt. The victims had been arranged methodically, efficiently, like inventory in a warehouse of death. As the investigation continued, the scope of Gacy's crimes became clear. Body after body was pulled from beneath his house, each one representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a future stolen. The victims were young men and boys, most between the ages of 14 and 21. They had been tortured, sexually assaulted, and murdered, their bodies discarded like garbage beneath the killer's feet. 26 bodies were recovered from the crawl space. 3 more were found buried elsewhere on Gacy's property. The remaining 4 victims, including Robert Paist, had been thrown into the Des Plaines River when there was no more room under the house. Gacy had literally run out of space to hide his crimes. Each discovery brought new horror. The handcuffs and rope found in Gacy's bedroom told the story of how he had restrained his victims. The lime scattered throughout the crawl space showed his attempts to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. The meticulous organization of the burial sites revealed the calculating mind of a serial killer who had turned murder into a routine. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the investigation was how long Gacy had been operating undetected. Some of the bodies had been buried for years, their identities lost to time and decomposition. These were the forgotten victims, the young men whose disappearances had been dismissed as runaways, whose families had been told to wait and see if they came home. The investigation revealed the full extent of society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. John Butkovich, who had disappeared in 1975 after going to collect his final paycheck from Gacy. John Syke, who vanished in 1977 and whose car Gacy had claimed to purchase when the young man left town. Billy Carroll, Gregory Godzik, Matthew Bowman, Robert Gilroy, John Mowery, Russell Nelson, Robert Winch, Tommy Bowling, David Talsma, William Kindred, Timothy O'Rourke, Frank Landingen, James Mazzara, Robert Paist. Names that had been forgotten, lives that had been dismissed, victims who had been failed by a system that didn't care enough to look. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. Here was a man who had hidden in plain sight, who had fooled neighbors, business associates, and political connections for years. The same hands that had entertained children as Pogo the Clown had strangled young men in the darkness of his home. The same voice that had charmed party guests and political allies had lured vulnerable teenagers to their deaths. The investigation continued for months as authorities worked to identify the victims and piece together the timeline of Gacy's crimes. Dental records, Missing person reports and personal effects helped put names to some of the remains, but several victims were never identified. They remain nameless to this day, their stories lost to the grave, their families never knowing what happened to their sons, their brothers, their loved ones. The case exposed the dark underbelly of American society in the 1970s, the way marginalized communities were ignored and forgotten. It revealed how homophobia and social prejudice had enabled a killer to operate with impunity, how the lives of certain young men were deemed less valuable than others. It showed how a charming exterior could hide monstrous evil, how trust could be weaponized by those who understood how to exploit it. As the full scope of John Wayne Gacy's crimes became public, the nation grappled with questions that had no easy answers. How had he gone undetected for so long? How many other predators were hiding in plain sight? How many other victims were buried in crawl spaces and thrown into rivers, their disappearances explained away by a society that preferred not to look too closely? The investigation also revealed the power of one family's refusal to accept easy explanations. If Harold and Elizabeth Peast had been told that their son was a runaway, if they had been dismissed and ignored like so many other families, John Wayne Gacy might have continued killing. It was their persistence, their love for their son, their refusal to let him become another forgotten statistic that finally brought down one of America's most prolific serial killers. The house on Summerdale Avenue became a symbol of hidden evil, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They smile and shake hands and participate in community events. They build successful businesses and take pictures with politicians. They dress up as clowns and entertain children while burying bodies beneath their homes. The investigation that would finally bring John Wayne Gacy to justice began with a single name whispered in desperation. When 15-year-old Robert Piest vanished on December 11th, 1978, his disappearance would crack open a case that had been festering in the shadows for years. But this wasn't just another runaway story that authorities could dismiss. This was different. This was the beginning of the end for one of America's most prolific serial killers. Robert Piest was everything the system typically ignored victims weren't. He was an honor student, a beloved son, a kid with a future. On that cold December evening, he was working his part-time job at Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, when John Wayne Gacy walked through the door. Gacy was there to discuss a potential remodeling job with the store owner, but what happened next would expose the horrifying truth that had been hidden beneath his suburban home for 6 long years. The pharmacy was busy that evening. Robert was working alongside his friend, Kim Byers, both teenagers earning money after school. At one point, Kim borrowed Rob's favorite blue parka, stuffing a film receipt into the pocket without thinking. That receipt would later become a crucial piece of evidence in the investigation. The night was supposed to be special for the Piest family. Elizabeth Piest, Robert's mother, was celebrating her 46th birthday, and a cake was waiting at home for her and her son. When Elizabeth arrived at the pharmacy at 8:55 p.m. to pick up Robert, everything seemed normal. She greeted Kim, she greeted Rob, and waited while he finished stocking shelves. But then Robert approached his mother with something that would change everything. He told her there was a contractor in the parking lot who wanted to talk to him about a job. He grabbed his coat, went out the door, and vanished into the night. For hours, Rob's family searched desperately. They learned the contractor's name was John Wayne Gacy, and when they couldn't find their son, they contacted police around 11 p.m. Like so many families before them, they were told to wait until morning to give it some time. But the Piests had no patience for bureaucratic delays. Their fear intensified when a police background check revealed something chilling. Gacy had been convicted 9 years earlier for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. He had served only 18 months of a 10-year sentence. The family rushed to the Des Plaines police station, where Elizabeth gasped to the watch officer, "My son, Robert Jerome Piest, is missing." This time, the police took notice. This wasn't another throwaway kid from the margins of society. This was an honors student from a loving family, and his disappearance couldn't be explained away as just another runaway. The investigation moved quickly. When detectives learned that Piest had disappeared shortly after speaking with Gacy about a job, they began to dig deeper into the contractor's background. What they found was a man who had successfully hidden his criminal past behind a facade of community respectability. Gacy had become a master manipulator, using his business connections and political ties to deflect suspicion. But the cracks in his carefully constructed mask were beginning to show. Police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. On December 13, 1978, they arrived at the ranch-style house that had become a tomb for dozens of young men. The smell that greeted them was unmistakable. It was the stench of death, seeping from every corner of the property. What investigators found beneath John Wayne Gacy's home defied comprehension. The crawl space was a graveyard, packed with the remains of young men who had simply vanished from the world above. 26 bodies were buried in that cramped, dark space beneath the house. 3 more were found elsewhere on the property. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and the nation. As the excavation continued, a horrifying pattern emerged. Most of the victims were young men between the ages of 14 and 30. Many had worked for Gacy's construction company, PDM contractors. Others were runaways or marginalized youth who had been lured to the house with promises of work or simply a place to stay. Gacy had preyed on society's most vulnerable, knowing that their disappearances would often go unnoticed or be dismissed. The investigation revealed the calculated nature of Gacy's crimes. He had perfected a system of luring victims to his home, often using the promise of employment or the guise of showing them a magic trick. Once inside, he would overpower them, often using handcuffs or rope. He would then rape, torture, and murder them before disposing of their bodies in the crawl space beneath his house. When that space became too crowded, he began dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River, which is where Robert Piest's body was eventually found. The community that had once celebrated Gacy as a pillar of respectability was stunned. How had this monster hidden among them for so long? The answer lay in the perfect storm of societal failures that had allowed him to operate with impunity. The homophobia of the 1970s meant that crimes against young men, especially those perceived as gay or marginalized, were often ignored or given less priority by law enforcement. Many of Gacy's victims were runaways or outcasts who had been rejected by their families, making them invisible to a society that preferred not to see them. The case also exposed the dangerous effectiveness of Gacy's public persona. Till His involvement in Democratic politics, his charitable work as Pogo the Clown, and his successful construction business had provided him with a shield of respectability that deflected suspicion. When families reported their sons missing, police often turned to Gacy as a witness rather than a suspect. He would calmly explain that the young men had quit their jobs or sold him their cars to get money to leave town. His word was trusted because he appeared to be everything a serial killer wasn't: successful, community-minded, and respectable. The investigation revealed other heartbreaking cases that had been dismissed or overlooked. John Butkovich, 18 years old, had vanished in 1975 while going to collect his final paycheck from Gacy. His body was the first to be identified when police excavated the garage. John Sick, 19, had disappeared in January 1977, but police had believed Gacy's story that the young man had sold him his car to get money to leave town. These cases, and dozens of others, painted a picture of a predator who had manipulated not just his victims, but the entire system designed to protect them. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy marked the end of one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history. But for the families of his victims, it was only the beginning of a long journey toward justice and understanding. The case would expose the systemic failures that had allowed Gacy to operate for so long, and it would forever change how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases, particularly those involving marginalized youth. The investigation that began with Robert Piest's disappearance had uncovered a horror that had been hiding in plain sight for years. It was a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears the mask of respectability, hiding behind community service and political connections. And sometimes it takes the disappearance of just one victim who couldn't be dismissed or forgotten to finally bring that evil into the light. The investigation that would finally expose John Wayne Gacy's horrific crimes began with a single missing person report. On the evening of December 11th, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest was working his shift at Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. It was supposed to be a special night, his mother's 46th birthday, and the family was waiting at home with cake and celebration. But when Elizabeth Piest arrived at the pharmacy at 8:55 p.m. to pick up her son, everything changed. Robert told his mother there was a contractor in the parking lot who wanted to talk to him about a potential job. The teenager grabbed his blue parka and walked out the door, vanishing into the December night. He never returned. For the Piest family, the nightmare had just begun. Unlike the families of Gacy's previous victims, they refused to wait. They refused to be told their son was just another runaway. They demanded action. The next morning, the Piests drove to the Des Plaines police station. Elizabeth could barely breathe as she gasped to the watch officer, "My son, Robert Jerome Piest, is missing." The family had already learned the contractor's name through their own investigation: John Wayne Gacy. When police ran a background check, they discovered something chilling. Gacy had been convicted 9 years earlier for sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. He had served only 18 months of a 10-year sentence. This wasn't just another missing teenager. This was different. Robert Piest was an honor student, a beloved son from a stable family. The public concern was immediate and intense. Police knew he was no runaway. When investigators approached Gacy about the missing boy, He insisted he knew nothing about Robert's whereabouts. His story was clean, rehearsed, but something didn't add up. The investigation intensified when police discovered that Gacy was still on parole for his previous conviction. They began surveillance of his Summerdale Avenue home, watching his every move. What they observed was a man who appeared calm, composed, going about his daily routine as if nothing had happened. But beneath that facade, investigators sensed something darker. On December 13th, 1978, police obtained a search warrant for Gacy's property. What they found would shock the nation and expose one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The search began in the house, where officers immediately noticed a strange, overwhelming stench. Gacy claimed it was a sewage problem, moisture issues in the crawl space beneath his home. But the smell was something else entirely. It was the smell of death. When investigators entered the crawl space, they discovered a horror beyond imagination. Lime had been scattered everywhere, an attempt to mask the odor of decomposition. As they dug deeper, they found the first body, then another and another. The victims had been buried in neat rows, like a grotesque cemetery beneath the floorboards of suburban Chicago. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition. Some had been there for years, reduced to skeletal remains. Others were more recent, their clothing still intact. Many had been bound with rope, their hands tied behind their backs. The evidence of torture was unmistakable. These weren't quick deaths. These were prolonged, sadistic murders. As the excavation continued, the scope of Gacy's crimes became clear. Body after body was unearthed from the crawl space. When there was no more room beneath the house, investigators found more victims buried in the backyard. The property had become a mass grave, a killing field hidden beneath the veneer of suburban normalcy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had known Gacy as a friendly contractor, a man who threw parties and entertained children as Pogo the Clown, struggled to comprehend the reality. How had this monster lived among them for so long? How had no one suspected? The answer lay in society's indifference to Gacy's victims. Most were young men who had been dismissed as runaways, throwaways, people whose disappearances didn't warrant serious investigation. The homophobia of the era meant that crimes against gay men were often overlooked or minimized. Gacy had exploited these societal blind spots, hunting among the vulnerable and forgotten. As the investigation progressed, families began coming forward, hoping to identify their missing loved ones. For years, they had been told their sons had simply run away, that they would return when they were ready. Now they learned the horrible truth. Their children hadn't run away. They had been murdered, tortured, and buried like garbage beneath a suburban home. The case revealed systemic failures at every level. Police departments had failed to connect disappearances across jurisdictions. Missing person reports had been filed away and forgotten. The very people who should have been protected by society had been abandoned to a predator who understood exactly how to exploit their vulnerability. Robert Piest's body was eventually found in the Des Plaines River, along with 3 other victims. By that time, there was no more room in Gacy's crawl space. The teenager who had simply wanted to talk to a contractor about a job had become the final victim, the one whose disappearance finally brought justice for all the others. The excavation of Gacy's property continued for weeks. In total, 26 bodies were found in the crawl space, 3 more buried elsewhere on the property, and 4 recovered from the Des Plaines River. 33 confirmed victims, though investigators suspected there may have been more. The sheer scale of the killing was unprecedented in American criminal history. Each victim had a story, a family, dreams that would never be fulfilled. They were sons, brothers, friends. They had names, identities, lives that mattered. But for years, they had been nothing more than missing person reports, forgotten cases filed away in dusty cabinets. It took the disappearance of one honor student to finally expose the truth and bring their killer to justice. The investigation that began with Elizabeth Peast's desperate plea for help had uncovered one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The man who had hidden behind the mask of respectability, who had entertained children and rubbed shoulders with politicians, was finally exposed for what he truly was, a monster who had preyed upon society's most vulnerable for over 6 years. The investigation reached its breaking point on a cold December night in 1978. Robert Peast, a 15-year-old honor student, was working his evening shift at Nazan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. It was supposed to be a special night. His mother, Elizabeth, was turning 46, and the family had a birthday cake waiting at home. Everyone was gathered, ready to celebrate. But Robert never made it home. At 8:55 that evening, Elizabeth walked into the pharmacy to pick up her son. She greeted him and his co-worker, Kim, expecting they'd be heading home within minutes. Robert was finishing up his stocking duties when he approached his mother around 9 o'clock. He told her there was a contractor in the parking lot who wanted to talk to him about a potential job. He grabbed his blue parka, the one Kim had borrowed earlier and stuffed with a film receipt, and walked out the door. He vanished into the night. For hours, the Piest family searched desperately. Along the way, they learned the contractor's name was John Wayne Gacy. When they contacted police around 11 that night, they were told to wait until morning to give it some time. But the Piests weren't willing to wait. Their fear wasn't unfounded when a background check revealed that Gacy had been convicted 9 years earlier of sexually assaulting a teenage boy in Iowa. He'd served only 18 months of a 10-year sentence. The family rushed to the Des Plaines police station. Elizabeth, barely able to control her breathing, gasped to the watch officer, "My son, Robert Jerome Piest, is missing." This time was different. This wasn't another runaway case that could be dismissed. Robert Piest was a beloved honors student with a stable family. The public concern was immediate and intense. Police knew he was no runaway. When investigators learned that Piest had disappeared shortly after speaking with Gacy about a job, they launched a thorough investigation despite Gacy's insistence that he knew nothing about the teenager's whereabouts. The contrast was stark and telling. It took the disappearance of a promising young man from a loving family to finally break open an investigation that had been ignored for years. The vulnerable victims, the runaways, the marginalized youth that Gacy had been preying upon, their disappearances had been explained away, dismissed, forgotten. But Robert Piest mattered to people in power. His life had value that the system recognized. On December 21st, 1978, armed with a search warrant, police arrived at Gacy's home at 82 Sunthrene West Summerdale Avenue. What they found would horrify the world and expose the true scope of one man's monstrous crimes. The smell hit them first, a sickening stench of death and decay that seemed to seep from the very walls of the house. It was a smell that neighbors had complained about for years, a smell that Gacy had explained away as sewer problems or dead animals. The search began methodically. Officers combed through every room, every closet, every corner of the property. But it was when they descended into the crawl space beneath the house that the full horror was revealed. There, in the damp, dark earth, they found the first body, then another, and another. The excavation continued for days. 26 bodies were eventually recovered from the crawl space alone, buried in lime to mask the smell. 3 more were found elsewhere on the property. The remaining 4 victims had been dumped in the Des Plaines River, including Robert Piest, whose body was recovered later. The river had become Gacy's overflow cemetery when there was simply no more room beneath his house. Each discovery brought new horror. The victims were primarily young men and teenage boys, many still wearing the clothes they died in. Some were found with ropes still around their necks. Others showed signs of the torture they'd endured before death mercifully released them. The handcuffs found in the attic told their own grim story of the magic tricks Gacy had performed on his victims, tricks with no escape. As the bodies were removed one by one, the full scope of Gacy's methodical brutality became clear. This wasn't the work of a man who lost control in moments of rage. This was calculated, systematic, efficient. He'd turned his home into a killing ground and a graveyard, entertaining neighbors and political associates just feet above the decomposing remains of his victims. The media descended on the quiet suburban neighborhood like a swarm. News vans lined the street as reporters struggled to comprehend how such evil could exist in plain sight. The man who'd posed with the First Lady, who'd entertained children as Pogo the Clown, who'd been a respected member of the community, was revealed as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But perhaps the most damning revelation was how easily it could have been prevented. The signs had been there for years. The smell that neighbors complained about. The young men who'd disappeared after working for Gacy's construction company. The suspicious circumstances surrounding employees who'd simply vanished. The system had failed these victims not through incompetence, but through indifference. The case highlighted the brutal reality of whose lives society deemed valuable. Robert Piest's disappearance triggered an immediate and thorough investigation because he fit the profile of a victim worth caring about. He was young, white, middle class, with a stable family and bright future. The other 32 victims had been disposable in the eyes of a system that saw runaways and marginalized youth as problems rather than people. John Wayne Gacy was arrested and charged with 33 counts of murder. The man who'd hidden behind the mask of respectability, who'd used his position in the community to deflect suspicion, finally faced justice. But for the families of his victims, for the survivors who'd escaped his clutches, for the community that had been deceived for so long, the damage was irreversible. The investigation revealed that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly face, shakes hands at political rallies, and makes children laugh at birthday parties. Sometimes it hides behind charitable work and community involvement. The most dangerous predators are often those who understand how to manipulate trust and exploit the vulnerabilities of a system designed to protect the powerful while ignoring the powerless. As the full extent of Gacy's crimes became known, one question haunted everyone involved. How many more victims might there have been if Robert Piest hadn't disappeared that December night? How many more young men would have vanished into the crawl space beneath that suburban house if one family hadn't refused to accept that their son was just another runaway? The answer was a chilling reminder that monsters don't just exist in our nightmares. They live among us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next vulnerable victim to cross their path. The investigation that followed Robert Piest's disappearance would shatter the carefully constructed facade that John Wayne Gacy had spent years building. Within hours of the missing person report, Des Plaines police had traced the last known contact to the contractor who had spoken with the boy at the pharmacy. When they ran a background check on John Wayne Gacy, what they discovered sent chills through the department. This wasn't just any local businessman. This was a man with a dark history, a convicted sex offender who had served time for the sodomy of a teenage boy in Iowa. The contrast was staggering. Here was a man who had seamlessly integrated himself into the fabric of suburban Chicago society, who had shaken hands with politicians and entertained children as a clown, yet he carried the shadow of a violent sexual crime in his past. The police realized they weren't dealing with a simple missing person case. They were potentially facing something far more sinister. Detective Lieutenant Joseph Kozenchak of the Des Plaines Police Department took charge of the investigation. Unlike the cases of other missing young men who had been dismissed as runaways, Robert Piest's disappearance commanded immediate attention. He was an honor student from a loving family, a boy who had never been in trouble, never shown signs of wanting to run away. When he failed to return home for his mother's birthday celebration, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The initial search of Gacy's property at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue seemed routine. Police arrived with a search warrant, expecting perhaps to find evidence of the teenager's whereabouts or some indication of what had happened to him. What they discovered instead would become one of the most horrifying crime scenes in American history. The house that had hosted countless neighborhood parties, where Gacy had entertained guests and maintained his image as a successful businessman, concealed a nightmare beneath its floors. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came from the smell. Even in the cold December air, there was an unmistakable odor of decay emanating from the house. Gacy had explanations ready, as he always did. He claimed it was a problem with the sewage system, a plumbing issue that had been bothering him for months. But the investigators weren't convinced. The smell was too distinctive, too organic, too much like death. When police began examining the crawl space beneath the house, they made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Buried in the narrow space under the floors, wrapped in plastic bags and covered with lime to mask the smell, were human remains. Not just one body, but multiple bodies, decomposing in the dark, cramped space that Gacy had turned into his personal graveyard. The excavation of Gacy's property became a media circus. News trucks lined the quiet suburban street as investigators worked around the clock to uncover the full scope of the horror. Body after body was removed from the crawl space, each one representing a life cut short, a family destroyed, a victim who had trusted the wrong person. The neighbors who had known Gacy as a friendly businessman who had attended his parties and worked with him on community projects watched in disbelief as their quiet street became the center of a national nightmare. As the body count rose, the true magnitude of Gacy's crimes became clear. This wasn't a single murder or even a few isolated incidents. This was systematic, methodical killing on a scale that shocked even experienced investigators. 26 bodies were found buried in the crawl space of his home. 3 more were discovered elsewhere on his property. 4 additional victims had been dumped in the Des Plaines River, including Robert Piest, the boy whose disappearance had finally brought Gacy's reign of terror to an end. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 30, young men and boys who had crossed paths with Gacy and never made it home. Some had worked for his construction company, lured by promises of good wages and steady employment. Others had been picked up at bus stations, bars, or on the streets, vulnerable young people who had fallen prey to Gacy's practiced charm and false promises. Many were runaways, or young men who had been estranged from their families, making them perfect targets for a predator who understood that they wouldn't be missed quickly. The investigation revealed the cold, calculated nature of Gacy's crimes. He had developed a routine, a method that allowed him to kill repeatedly without detection. He would lure victims to his home, often under the pretense of offering them work or a place to stay. Once inside, he would incapacitate them, sometimes using what he called his rope trick or handcuff trick, demonstrations that he claimed were magic tricks, but were actually methods of restraint that left his victims helpless. What happened next was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Gacy would torture his victims, subjecting them to hours of abuse before finally killing them. He showed no remorse, no hesitation, no humanity. To him, these young men were not people with hopes and dreams and families who loved them. They were objects to be used and discarded, their lives meaningless in the face of his twisted desires. The disposal of the bodies revealed the extent of Gacy's planning and preparation. He had carefully calculated how many bodies he could fit in his crawl space, arranging them with the same methodical precision he brought to his construction work. When the space became too crowded, he began disposing of bodies in the Des Plaines River, weighting them down to prevent them from surfacing. The lime he used to control the smell, the plastic bags he wrapped the bodies in, the careful positioning to maximize space, all of it spoke to a man who had turned murder into a routine. As investigators pieced together the timeline of Gacy's crimes, they realized that he had been killing for years while maintaining his public persona as a respected community member. He had attended political meetings with blood on his hands. He had entertained children as Pogo the Clown while bodies decomposed beneath his house. He had built successful business while using his employees as a hunting ground for victims. The duplicity was staggering, the ability to compartmentalize his life so completely that even those closest to him had no idea what he was capable of. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Here was a man who had seemed to embody the American dream, a successful businessman who had overcome a troubled past to build a new life. The revelation that he was actually one of the most prolific serial killers in American history shattered the illusion of suburban safety and forced people to confront the disturbing reality that evil could hide behind the most ordinary facades. The investigation also exposed the systemic failures that had allowed Gacy to operate for so long. The dismissal of missing person reports as runaways, the reluctance to investigate crimes against marginalized communities, the assumption that young men who disappeared had simply chosen to leave. All of these factors had created an environment where a predator could hunt with impunity. The case became a catalyst for changes in how missing person cases were handled, particularly those involving young adults who might previously have been written off as runaways. For the families of Gacy's victims, the discovery of the bodies brought a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. After years of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones, they finally had answers. But those answers came with the devastating knowledge of what their sons, brothers, and friends had endured in their final hours. The pain was compounded by the realization that their missing loved ones had been dismissed by authorities, their cases not given the attention they deserved because of who they were and where they came from. The case of John Wayne Gacy stands as one of the most chilling examples of how evil can hide in plain sight. It demonstrates the danger of assumptions and stereotypes, the way that prejudice and indifference can create opportunities for predators to operate. It shows how a charming exterior can mask the darkest impulses, how someone can be a pillar of the community by day and a monster by night. But perhaps most importantly, it serves as a reminder of the humanity of the victims. These were not just statistics or case numbers. They were young men with dreams and ambitions, people who deserved to live full lives, to find love, to make their mark on the world. Their lives were cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than objects for his gratification, but they were so much more than that. They were sons and brothers, friends and lovers, each one a unique individual whose loss left a permanent hole in the world. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy extends far beyond the horror of his crimes. It has changed how we think about serial killers, how we investigate missing persons, how we protect vulnerable populations. It has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about society, about the way we treat those on the margins, about the assumptions we make based on class and sexuality and social status. The arrest of John Wayne Gacy on December 21st, 1978, marked the beginning of one of the most intensive and disturbing criminal investigations in American history. As police officers thus led him away in handcuffs, the full scope of his crimes was only beginning to emerge. The excavation of his property would continue for weeks, each day bringing new horrors to light, and new families facing the devastating confirmation of their worst fears. The recovery process was methodical and heartbreaking. Forensic teams worked tirelessly in the cramped, fetid crawl space beneath Gacy's house, carefully removing remains while attempting to preserve any evidence that might help identify the victims. The smell that neighbors had complained about for years now made perfect, horrifying sense. What had been dismissed as sewer problems or dead animals was actually the decomposition of dozens of human bodies, a testament to how easily terrible truths can be overlooked when they don't fit our expectations of normalcy. As the body count rose, so did the public's fascination and horror. The media descended upon the quiet suburban neighborhood, transforming it into a circus of reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue became a symbol of hidden evil, a place where the American dream had been perverted into something nightmarish. Neighbors who had lived next door to Gacy for years struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster who had been operating literally beneath their feet. The identification process proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation. Many of Gacy's victims were young men who had been estranged from their families, runaways, or individuals whose disappearances had not been thoroughly investigated. Dental records, when available, became crucial tools for identification. Personal effects found with the bodies sometimes provided the only clues to their identities. The process was painstaking and often heartbreaking, as families were forced to confront the reality that their loved ones had died in unimaginable circumstances. Dr. Robert Stein, the Cook County medical examiner, faced the unprecedented challenge of processing and identifying the victims. His team worked around the clock, using every available forensic technique to give names back to the nameless dead. The condition of many remains made identification extremely difficult, and several victims remain unidentified to this day, their stories lost forever in the darkness of Gacy's crawl space. The legal proceedings that followed were equally complex and emotionally charged. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980, nearly 14 months after his arrest. The prosecution, led by William Kunkel, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of crimes so extensive and horrific that they seemed almost beyond comprehension. The defense, meanwhile, pursued an insanity plea, arguing that no sane person could have committed such acts. The insanity defense became a central battleground in the trial. Gacy's attorneys argued that his actions were the result of severe mental illness, pointing to his troubled childhood, history of head injuries, and the sheer incomprehensibility of his crimes as evidence of his inability to distinguish right from wrong. They painted a picture of a man driven by uncontrollable compulsions, someone who was as much a victim of his own diseased mind as those he had killed. The prosecution countered with evidence of Gacy's calculated behavior, his ability to maintain relationships and run a business, and his careful efforts to conceal his crimes. They argued that his actions showed clear premeditation and awareness of wrongdoing. The methodical way he had disposed of bodies, his ability to maintain his public persona, and his attempts to mislead police all pointed to a man who knew exactly what he was doing and understood the consequences of his actions. Psychiatric testimony became crucial to both sides. Multiple experts examined Gacy, and their conclusions varied dramatically. Some found evidence of severe personality disorders and psychosis, while others concluded that while he was certainly disturbed, he was legally sane and fully responsible for his actions. The conflicting expert opinions highlighted the complexities of determining legal insanity in cases involving such extreme criminal behavior. Throughout the trial, Gacy himself remained largely emotionless, occasionally showing flashes of anger or irritation, but never expressing genuine remorse for his victims. His demeanor in court was described as detached and sometimes arrogant, as if he were watching proceedings that didn't really concern him. This apparent lack of empathy or remorse only reinforced the prosecution's argument that he was a calculating predator rather than a victim of mental illness. The testimony of survivors and witnesses painted a horrifying picture of Gacy's methods and mindset. Those who had escaped his clutches described his transformation from charming host to violent predator. the way his entire demeanor would change once he had his victims isolated and helpless. Their accounts provided crucial insight into his methods and helped establish the pattern of predatory behavior that had claimed so many lives. The trial also revealed the extent to which Gacy had compartmentalized his life. Witnesses testified about his community involvement, his business dealings, and his social relationships, creating a picture of a man who had successfully maintained multiple identities. To some, he was a respected businessman and community leader. To others, he was a friendly neighbor and entertaining party host. To his victims, he was a monster who destroyed their lives with methodical precision. On March 13th, 1980, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, the jury found Gacy guilty on all counts. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. The jury had rejected the insanity defense, concluding that despite his obvious psychological problems, Gacy had been aware of his actions and capable of controlling them. The penalty phase of the trial focused on whether Gacy should receive the death penalty or life imprisonment. The prosecution argued that the sheer scale of his crimes, their premeditated nature, and the suffering he had inflicted on his victims and their families warranted the ultimate punishment. The defense continued to argue for mercy, citing his mental illness and troubled background as mitigating factors. The families of victims was provided some of the most powerful testimony during the penalty phase. Their impact statements revealed the devastating ripple effects of Gacy's crimes, the years of uncertainty and anguish they had endured, and the profound loss they continued to feel. Many spoke of young men who had been just beginning their lives, who had dreams and aspirations that were cut short by Gacy's violence. On March 13th of 1980, the same day as his conviction, Gacy was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders and to life imprisonment for the others. The sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that his crimes were among the most heinous in American criminal history, deserving of the ultimate punishment available under the law. Gacy's time on death row stretched for 14 years, during which he became something of a celebrity among those fascinated by serial killers. He granted interviews, painted pictures that were sold to collectors, and maintained correspondence with numerous individuals drawn to his notoriety. His artwork, often featuring clowns and other disturbing imagery, became sought-after collectibles in the macabre world of serial killer memorabilia. Throughout his years on death row, Gacy never expressed genuine remorse for his crimes. He continued to maintain his innocence in some cases and showed no empathy for his victims or their families. His behavior reinforced the image of him as a narcissistic predator who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. The appeals process was lengthy and complex, with Gacy's attorneys challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentence. They argued that he had not received adequate representation, that the evidence had been improperly handled, and that his mental state had not been properly considered. Each appeal was ultimately rejected, with courts consistently finding that his conviction and sentence were appropriate given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the heinous nature of his crimes. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His final words were reportedly defiant rather than remorseful, consistent with his behavior throughout his imprisonment. The execution brought a measure of closure to some families, though many noted that no punishment could truly balance the scales of justice for the lives he had taken and the suffering he had caused. The impact of Gacy's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case prompted significant changes in how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons cases, particularly those involving young adults and marginalized individuals. The revelation that so many disappearances had not been thoroughly investigated led to reforms in police procedures and greater attention to patterns that might indicate serial criminal activity. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of certain populations to predators like Gacy. Many of his victims were young men who were estranged from their families, struggling with their sexuality, or living on the margins of society. Their disappearances had often been dismissed or inadequately investigated, partly due to assumptions about their lifestyles and choices. The Gacy case brought attention to these systemic failures and led to greater awareness of the need to protect all members of society, regardless of their circumstances. The psychological impact of the case on the community was profound and lasting. The revelation that such evil had existed in their midst, hidden behind a facade of respectability and community involvement, shattered many people's sense of security and trust. The neighborhood where Gacy had lived never fully recovered from the notoriety, with many residents moving away and property values plummeting. The case also had broader cultural implications, contributing to a growing awareness of the phenomenon of serial killing and the ways in which such predators operate. Gacy's ability to maintain a public persona while committing horrific crimes became a template for understanding how serial killers can hide in plain sight, using their apparent normalcy as camouflage for their true nature. Law enforcement agencies across the country studied the Gacy case to better understand how to identify and investigate similar crimes. The methodical way he had disposed of bodies, his victim selection process, and his ability to avoid detection for so long provided valuable insights into the behavior of serial predators. These lessons have been incorporated into training programs and investigative protocols used to this day. The media coverage of the case also raised important questions about the public's fascination with serial killers and the potential for such coverage to glorify or sensationalize their crimes. The intense interest in Gacy's story, while understandable given its shocking nature, also demonstrated the fine line between legitimate public interest and unhealthy obsession with criminal behavior. Decades after his execution, John Wayne Gacy remains a subject of study and analysis for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals. His case continues to be examined for insights into the development of serial killers, the factors that enable them to operate undetected, and the methods that can be used to identify and stop them before they claim more victims. The victims of John Wayne Gacy deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a horrific crime, but as individuals who had lives, dreams, and people who loved them. Each represented a unique loss, a future cut short by senseless violence. Their stories serve as a reminder of the human cost of such crimes and the importance of remaining vigilant against those who would prey upon the vulnerable. The case of John Wayne Gacy stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history, a stark reminder that evil can wear a familiar face and hide behind a veneer of respectability. It challenges us to look beyond surface appearances and to remain committed to protecting all members of our society, particularly those who are most vulnerable to exploitation and violence. In the end, the story of John Wayne Gacy is not just about one man's descent into evil, but about the failures of systems and communities to recognize and respond to warning signs. It is about the importance of taking all missing persons seriously, of looking out for the marginalized and vulnerable, and of never assuming that a pleasant exterior necessarily reflects the reality of someone's character. The legacy of this case continues to influence how we understand, investigate, and prevent such crimes. While we cannot bring back the 33 young men and boys who lost their lives to Gacy's violence, we can honor their memory by working to ensure that such tragedies are less likely to occur in the future. Their stories remind us that behind every statistic is a human being whose life had value and whose loss continues to reverberate through the lives of those who knew and loved them. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy extends far beyond the horrific crimes he committed between 1968 and 1978. His case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing person investigations, particularly when the victims come from marginalized communities. The systemic failures that allowed Gacy to operate undetected for so long forced police departments across America to reevaluate their protocols and biases. In the decades following his execution, numerous reforms have been implemented to prevent similar oversights. The creation of centralized databases for missing persons, improved communication between jurisdictions, and enhanced training regarding LGBTQ issues have all emerged partly as responses to the institutional negligence exposed by the Gacy investigation. The case also highlighted the deadly consequences of societal prejudice, as many of his victims were dismissed or ignored simply because of their sexual orientation or perceived lifestyle choices. The psychological profile of John Wayne Gacy continues to fascinate and terrify criminologists, psychologists, and the general public. His ability to compartmentalize his public persona from his private horrors represents one of the most extreme examples of criminal duality ever documented. Unlike many serial killers who operate as social outcasts, Gacy thrived in community settings, using his charm and civic involvement as both a shield and a hunting ground. This contradiction challenges our fundamental assumptions about how evil manifests in society. Dr. Helen Morrison, who interviewed Gacy extensively, noted that he never showed genuine remorse for his crimes, instead maintaining his innocence or attempting to shift blame even in his final days. This psychological detachment, combined with his methodical approach to murder and body disposal, places him among the most calculating and cold-blooded killers in criminal history. His case files continue to be studied in criminal psychology programs worldwide, serving as a stark reminder of how personality disorders can manifest in the most destructive ways possible. The families of Gacy's victims have endured decades of pain that extends far beyond the initial loss of their loved ones. Many struggled with the stigma attached to their family members' deaths, particularly given the social attitudes of the 1970s and 1980s. The lengthy legal proceedings, media sensationalism, and public fascination with the case created additional trauma for those already grieving. Some families have become advocates for victims' rights, working to ensure that future cases receive more sensitive and thorough treatment. The discovery of unidentified remains beneath Gacy's house created lasting mysteries that persist today. Despite advances in DNA technology and forensic science, several victims remain unnamed, their identities lost to time and circumstance. The Cook County Sheriff's Office continues to work on these cold cases, using modern techniques to hopefully provide closure to families who may never have known what happened to their missing loved ones. Media coverage of the Gacy case set precedents for how serial killer stories are reported and consumed by the public. The intense fascination with his crimes spawned countless books, documentaries, films, and television shows, establishing a template for true crime entertainment that continues today. However, this media attention has also raised ethical questions about the glorification of killers and the potential impact on copycat criminals. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, where Gacy committed his crimes, was demolished in 1979, but its location remains a point of morbid curiosity. The lot sat empty for years before new construction finally took place, reflecting the challenge of moving forward from such concentrated evil. The neighborhood itself struggled with the stigma and trauma associated with hosting one of America's most notorious crime scenes. Law enforcement techniques developed during the Gacy investigation have influenced countless subsequent cases. The methodical excavation of his property, the coordination between multiple agencies, and the integration of forensic science with traditional detective work established new standards for handling complex serial murder cases. These innovations have saved lives and solved crimes that might otherwise have remained mysteries. Today, more than 4 decades after his arrest, John Wayne Gacy's name remains synonymous with the darkest aspects of human nature. His case serves as a perpetual warning about the masks that evil can wear and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. The 33 known victims represent not just statistics in a criminal case, but individual lives cut short by unimaginable cruelty. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy extends far beyond the horrific crimes he committed. His case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches missing persons investigations, particularly when victims come from marginalized communities. The systemic failures that allowed Gacy to operate undetected for so long forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives were valued and whose disappearances were taken seriously. For the families of his victims, the pain never truly ends. Many struggled for years just to have their loved ones identified among the remains found in that crawl space. The psychological trauma rippled through entire communities, shattering the illusion of safety and trust that had once existed. Gacy's story serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears a familiar face. He wasn't the stereotypical monster lurking in dark alleys. He was a neighbor, a businessman, a clown who entertained children at birthday parties. This duality makes his crimes all the more terrifying and serves as a sobering lesson about the masks people can wear. Today, John Wayne Gacy remains one of America's most notorious serial killers, his name forever linked to the 33 lives he brutally ended. His case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals, ensuring that the lessons learned from this tragedy might help prevent future horrors from going undetected.